You can't understand modern China without understanding one specific day. August 29th, 1842. The day China signed a treaty that didn't just take territory, it shattered their entire worldview. Everything China does now traces back to that moment. Let me show you how. But first, you need to understand what was lost, because you can't understand the trauma without understanding what world existed before it shattered. Imagine living your entire life inside a system that made sense, where there were rules, where virtue mattered, where civilization meant something, where power was legitimate when it was moral, and illegitimate when it wasn't, where the universe itself seemed to operate on principles of harmony and hierarchy that everyone understood. This was China before 1840. The Qing Empire didn't just think of itself as a country among countries. That framework wouldn't have made sense to them. China was the center, the Middle Kingdom, the civilization around which others orbited. This wasn't arrogance in the way we think about it. It was closer to a cosmological fact. For thousands of years, this worldview had been reinforced by reality itself. Neighbors came bearing tribute. They adopted Chinese writing, Chinese philosophy, Chinese models of government. Even conquerors who took power in China became Chinese. The Mongols, the Manchus. They didn't replace Chinese civilization. They were absorbed by it, because Chinese civilization was the civilizing force. It was what separated order from chaos. The tributary system wasn't just diplomacy, it was a moral architecture. Countries in the region acknowledged China's centrality. They sent gifts, performed rituals of respect, received confirmation of their own legitimacy in return. But this wasn't extraction. It was harmony. The emperor didn't rule through force, he ruled through virtue. The mandate of heaven wasn't military might, it was moral authority. This is what people miss when they try to understand historical China. They project modern concepts of nationalism and power politics backward, but Qing China in 1800 didn't think in those terms. They thought in terms of civilization versus barbarism, order versus chaos, the cultivated versus the uncultivated. And here's the key. For the most part, this worldview worked. It predicted reality. It explained things. When the emperor was virtuous, the kingdom prospered. When harvests failed or rebellions erupted, it meant heaven was displeased. There was a logic, a coherence, a sense of how things operated. Chinese officials were educated in this system. They spent decades studying the classics, learning how proper governance worked, how virtue manifested in policy, how civilization spread through example rather than coercion. They weren't naive. They understood that military force existed, but they also understood that force without legitimacy was just banditry. Real power, a sustainable power, came from being in alignment with the moral order of the universe. This was sophisticated. This was thousands of years of philosophy and statecraft. This was the longest continuously running civilization on Earth, operating according to principles that had been refined across dynasties, across centuries, across the rise and fall of a dozen empires that had tried to challenge it and failed. So when British ships appeared on the horizon in the early 1800s, Chinese officials weren't worried. They dealt with barbarians before. Everyone eventually learned. Everyone eventually understood that Chinese civilization was what brought you into the civilized world. You didn't threaten it, you petitioned to join it. The British would learn too. They always did. Except they didn't. The British arrived with a completely different operating system. One that didn't have a slot for Chinese exceptionalism. One that didn't care about virtue or harmony or the mandate of heaven. They arrived believing in markets, in trade, in the right of nations to interact as equals, in contracts that were enforced by power, not morality, in a world where military technology determined who got to set the terms and everything else was just decoration. To the Chinese, the British were barbarians, uncultivated, uncivilized, people who needed to be taught how the world worked. Their requests for diplomatic equality were confused at best, insulting at worst. You don't negotiate with the emperor as equals. You acknowledge his supremacy, perform the kowtow, receive his benevolence, and operate within the framework he provides. To the British, this was insane. They were representatives of the most powerful empire on Earth. They had technology that could flatten cities. They had wealth that dwarfed entire continents. and they were being asked to prostrate themselves in front of a monarch who wouldn't even grant them basic trading rights. Unacceptable. But here's what made this collision so devastating. Both sides were operating inside internally coherent worldviews. This wasn't stupidity. The Chinese weren't being stubborn for no reason. The British weren't being needlessly aggressive. Both were doing what made sense inside their frameworks. The problem was that only one framework had the firepower to enforce itself. The early interactions were almost farcical. British diplomats trying to explain concepts like treaty ports and most favoured nation status. Chinese officials treating these discussions like they were humouring children. Both sides walking away from meetings absolutely certain they'd made their position clear. Both sides completely misunderstanding what the other actually wanted. But underneath this diplomatic dance was something more ominous. The British were selling opium. Vast quantities of opium. Grown in India, shipped to China, traded for silver. And it was destroying Chinese society. This wasn't a grey area. Opium was illegal in China. It was prohibited precisely because everyone could see what it was doing. Addictions spreading through port cities, silver draining out of the empire, social fabric weakening. This was a clear violation of Chinese law happening on Chinese soil, so China did what any sovereign state would do. They enforced their laws. They confiscated the opium, thousands of chests of it. They destroyed it publicly. They sent a message: you don't get to poison our people and profit from it. This was reasonable. This was what sovereignty meant. If you can't enforce your own laws in your own territory, what does sovereignty even mean? But to the British, this was theft, destruction of property, a violation of free trade, an insult to British dignity, and most importantly, something that would hurt profits. So they sent warships. This is where everything changed. The first Opium War wasn't really a war in the traditional sense. It was a revelation, a demonstration, a brutal education in what power actually meant in the 19th century. Chinese forces fought. They weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. They used the strategies and weapons that had worked for centuries. They had superior numbers. They were defending their own territory. They had every advantage except the one that mattered: technology. British steam-powered gunboats could sail against the wind, against the current. They could position themselves anywhere. Chinese junks were floating targets. British artillery had range and accuracy that made Chinese cannons look like toys. British infantry had rifles that could be fired and reloaded while Chinese soldiers were still preparing their matchlocks. But it wasn't just the technology. It was what the technology revealed. Every battle was the same story. Chinese forces in defensive positions, confident in their fortifications, ready to repel the barbarians. Then, British ships appearing at impossible angles. Artillery striking from distances that shouldn't have been possible. Walls that had stood for centuries crumbling under sustained bombardment. Cities falling not because of Chinese weakness, but because the entire paradigm of warfare had shifted without anyone telling them. Imagine being a Chinese general who'd spent his entire life studying military classics, learning about strategy and deception and morale, understanding how battles were won through superior positioning, through exploiting terrain, through understanding human psychology. All of that knowledge, centuries of it, refined across countless conflicts, suddenly made irrelevant by the fact that the enemy has guns that shoot farther. This was humiliating in a way that went beyond military defeat. This was the universe not working the way it was supposed to. Chinese soldiers were brave. Chinese generals were intelligent. Chinese fortifications were well designed. None of it mattered. The rules had changed, and nobody had informed them. The war dragged on for 3 years. Not because China had any hope of victory, but because the logistics of surrender are complicated when you have never conceptually prepared for the possibility that the barbarians might win. Qing officials tried everything. They appealed to morality. They offered compromises. They attempted to leverage China's size and population. They hoped that British supply lines would stretch too thin, that winter would come, that heaven would intervene, that something would restore the natural order. Nothing did. By 1842, British forces controlled key ports along the coast. They'd sailed up the Yangtze River, deep into Chinese territory, somewhere that should have been impossible to reach without Chinese permission. They were threatening to cut off the Grand Canal, which would have starved Beijing of food supplies. China had lost. completely, undeniably, to a force that shouldn't have been able to defeat them. And now came the worst part, the negotiations. The Treaty of Nanjing wasn't just a document, it was the moment Chinese officials had to sit across from British representatives and accept, in writing, a new reality. Everything was wrong about this moment. They were negotiating under threat. British gunboats were visible from where the treaty was being signed. This wasn't diplomacy, this was capitulation with paperwork. But calling it capitulation would have been admitting something unsayable. So it was called a treaty, as if treaties weren't supposed to be between equals, as if this was a negotiation rather than dictation of terms. The provisions were designed to hurt, not just strategically, psychologically. China would pay an indemnity, 21 million silver dollars. This wasn't restitution. This was tribute. The civilization that received tribute was now paying it. The inversion was deliberate. The British knew what this meant in the Chinese symbolic order. They weren't just demanding money, they were forcing China to perform its own subordination. Hong Kong would be ceded to Britain. Forever. A piece of Chinese territory now British. Not leased. Not temporarily occupied. Given away. Sovereignty wasn't supposed to be divisible. You were either sovereign or you weren't. But apparently you could be forced to be both simultaneously. 5 ports would be open to British trade. Treaty ports. Foreign enclaves where British law applied to British subjects. Where Chinese authorities had no jurisdiction. This wasn't trade access. This was extraterritoriality, the dismantling of sovereignty from the inside. Foreign territory inside Chinese borders, operating under foreign rules, and Chinese law enforcement unable to enter. And here's the provision that cut deepest. China would be forced to accept British consular officials. Officials who would have direct access to Chinese authorities, who would be treated as equals. No more tributary protocol, no more kowtow, no more acknowledgement of Chinese superiority. Britain was demanding diplomatic equality at gunpoint. Sit with that for a moment. You're a Chinese official who has spent your entire life studying how the world works, how virtue and civilization create legitimacy, how the moral order is enforced through adherence to ritual and propriety, and now you're being forced to sign a document that says none of that matters. That might makes right, that the only real rule is whoever has the bigger guns gets to set the terms. This wasn't just a diplomatic defeat, this was a cognitive break, a moment where the map and the territory diverged so completely that the map had to be thrown away. Chinese negotiators tried to salvage what they could. They tried to find language that would preserve dignity. They tried to frame the concessions as temporary, as gracious allowances from the emperor rather than forced extraction. They tried to make it make sense inside the old framework. But everyone in that room knew the truth. The emperor hadn't chosen this. Heaven hadn't ordained it. China wasn't granting these concessions from a position of strength. They were being taken. And China couldn't stop it. The moment the treaty was signed, something fundamental shifted in how China understood the world. The old cosmology didn't work anymore. The belief that virtue protected you, that civilization was its own defense, that the universe rewarded righteousness, all of it was revealed as dangerously naive. The world wasn't fair. It was never going to be fair. And any system built on the assumption of fairness was a system built to be exploited by those who understood that power was all that actually mattered. The aftermath was chaos, not military chaos, psychological chaos. How do you integrate this information? How do you maintain cognitive consistency when everything you were taught about how the world works has just been disproven by events? Some officials argued that China had simply been unfortunate, that this was a temporary setback, that if China modernized its military, adopted Western technology, everything could return to normal. This was the self-strengthening movement, the belief that the problem was technical, not fundamental. Others saw deeper. They understood that this wasn't about guns and ships. This was about the entire philosophical architecture of Chinese civilization being incompatible with the world that was emerging. That the choice was to either fundamentally transform how China understood itself or continue losing. Reading their correspondence from this period is reading people trying to maintain sanity while their worldview collapses. They write about confusion, about shame, about the impossibility of explaining to the emperor why heaven allowed this. Some committed suicide. not because of personal dishonor, because they couldn't bear living in a world that didn't make sense anymore. The ones who survived did so by adapting, by learning that if the world operates on power, then China needs to acquire power, not moral authority, not civilizational prestige, hard power, the ability to hurt those who hurt you. The Treaty of Nanjing should have been a one-time catastrophe, a terrible lesson but still just one event. Except it wasn't one event, it was the template. Over the next 60 years, China would sign dozens of treaties just like it, each one carving away a little more sovereignty, each one reinforcing the same lesson. The British came back for more concessions. The French came, the Russians came, the Germans came, the Japanese came. All of them demanded treaty ports, extraterritoriality, indemnities, territorial concessions. All of them threatened war if China refused. And here's what made it worse. The world treated this as normal. Picture Shanghai in 1900. In the heart of a Chinese city, there are zones where Chinese police cannot enter, where Chinese law doesn't apply, where a Chinese person can be assaulted by a foreigner and have no legal recourse because the foreigner is under British or French or American jurisdiction. Signs on parks that say, "No dogs or Chinese." Courts where Chinese testimony is worth less than foreign testimony. A Chinese government official who needs permission from foreign consuls to govern his own city. This wasn't occupation. This was the legal international order, codified, accepted, enforced by every major power. China wasn't being invaded. It was being systematically hollowed out by treaties that the entire world recognized as legitimate. The Second Opium War brought more ports, more concessions, more territory lost. The Summer Palace, a symbol of Chinese architectural and artistic achievement, was burned to the ground by British and French forces. Not for strategic reasons, to send a message. The Boxer Rebellion in 1900 was China's attempt to expel foreigners through force. It failed spectacularly. 8 foreign powers invaded. They occupied Beijing. They forced China to pay an indemnity so large it would take 40 years to repay. They stationed foreign troops on Chinese soil permanently. Through all of this, the international community treated it as legitimate, as how things worked. Because China was weak, and weakness was its own crime. China kept appealing to international law, to principles of sovereignty, to basic fairness, and the world kept demonstrating that those things were decorative, that they applied between powerful countries as mutual restraint, but they didn't apply to protect weak countries from strong ones. By the early 20th century, China wasn't even a coherent state anymore. It was a collection of spheres of influence, territory controlled by warlords, cities where foreign powers held more authority than the Chinese government. And every single step of this decline was legal. By the standards of the international order at the time, everything that happened to China was permissible, because the international order was written by the powerful to benefit the powerful. When the Communist Party took power in 1949, they didn't need to invent a historical narrative. It was already there, living memory. There were people still alive who remembered foreign troops in Beijing, who remembered treaty ports, who remembered extraterritoriality, who remembered what it felt like to be powerless in your own country. Mao's genius was understanding that the deep wound in Chinese civilization was sovereignty, that the Chinese people would endure anything, poverty, famine, political upheaval, as long as they believed they would never be vulnerable to foreign domination again. China has stood up wasn't a political slogan. It was psychological repair. The promise that the century of humiliation was over, that never again would foreign powers dictate terms to China. This became the organizing principle of the Chinese state, not democracy, not human rights, not economic freedom, sovereignty, the absolute, unconditional, non-negotiable right of China to control its own territory without foreign interference. The CCP didn't have to convince people this was important. The trauma was too recent. The fear was too real. Chinese schoolchildren still learn about the Treaty of Nanjing. They visit museums dedicated to the century of humiliation. They're taught that weakness invited predation, that modern China must never be weak again. This creates institutional memory that functions as policy. American officials wonder why China won't accept the rules-based international order. They don't understand that from China's perspective, that phrase is exactly what the Treaty of Nanjing was, a system designed by the powerful to protect their interests while using the language of universality to make it seem legitimate. From China's perspective, the most dangerous lie in international politics is the promise that power has been replaced by rules. China's response? Build parallel systems. Create alternative institutions. Develop technology independently. Never rely on anyone else for anything critical. Become too powerful to be pushed around. And never forget what happens when you trust the international order to protect you. Watch China's behavior today through this lens and everything clicks into focus. Taiwan, the final piece of the century of humiliation still unresolved. Foreign powers interfering in what China considers internal affairs. The fear that if Taiwan is lost, it proves China is still weak. The South China Sea, maritime sovereignty, never again being blockaded by foreign navies. Historical memory of British gunboats sailing wherever they wanted. Hong Kong? The handover in 1997 wasn't just returning territory, it was psychological closure, taking back what was taken in 1842. The national security law is the absolute refusal to allow foreign influence to undermine Chinese sovereignty. Economic policy. The entire development model is built on the lesson that economic dependence is vulnerability. The only safe economy is a self-sufficient economy. Technology policy. The desperation to achieve tech independence is about never again being at the mercy of foreign technology restrictions. You can't trust others to sell you what you need to defend yourself. Belt and Road? Creating a world where Chinese interests are embedded in dozens of countries, where China has leverage over others for once, where the rules benefit China instead of constraining it. The defense budget, the aircraft carriers, the hypersonic missiles, all of it is saying never again. Western commentators talk about Chinese aggression. But from inside the Chinese frame, this is defensive. This is what security looks like when you've learned that the world is fundamentally unsafe. When you've learned that the only way to be safe is to be so powerful that attacking you is unthinkable. This doesn't mean China is right about everything. It doesn't mean you have to agree with specific policies. But it does mean that if you don't understand the historical trauma driving these behaviors, you're going to keep misinterpreting Chinese actions as unprovoked aggression when China sees them as defensive necessity. China looks at the international order and sees a system that nearly destroyed it. That took a century to recover from, and now that same system is asking China to trust it, to accept limitations on its sovereignty, to believe that this time the rules will be applied fairly. And China's answer, shaped by memory, hardened by trauma, institutionalized across generations, is no, never again. So here we are. 182 years after the Treaty of Nanjing, the Qing dynasty is gone. The century of humiliation is supposedly over. China is powerful now. Everything that was taken has been reclaimed, rebuilt, surpassed. But the wound never healed. This is the thing about formative trauma. It doesn't matter if circumstances change. The lesson learned during the trauma becomes permanent. China today is powerful. But it doesn't feel powerful. It feels vulnerable. Because vulnerability isn't about current strength. It's about remembered powerlessness. Every Chinese government official, every military planner, every policy strategist operates inside this framework. Not because they're propagandized, because their grandparents lived it. Because the museums document it. Because the lesson is, trust killed China once. For China, 1842 is not history. It's a condition. The tragedy is that both China and the West are acting rationally inside their frameworks. The West genuinely believes in the value of the international system. China genuinely believes that system is a trap, and both have historical evidence for their positions. The West points to 70 years of relative peace. China points to those 70 years being built on hegemony that's now being challenged. The West points to international institutions as neutral arbiters. China points to those institutions being designed by Western powers. The West points to international law as universal. China points to international law being violated whenever it's convenient for powerful countries. Neither side is completely wrong, but China has one thing the West doesn't: Lived memory of what happens when you trust the system and the system betrays you. You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with Chinese policies. You don't have to think Chinese actions are justified. But if you want to understand why China does what it does, you have to understand that in China's institutional memory, 1842 is yesterday. The century of humiliation never ended. It just paused while China built enough strength to prevent it from happening again. And every time a Western country talks about freedom of navigation, China hears British gunboats. Every time there's talk of protecting Taiwan, China hears foreign interference. Every time there's a technology restriction, China hears deliberate attempts to keep it weak. Every time there's criticism of domestic policy, China hears the moral superiority that preceded colonization. This is the lens. This is how trauma works. It becomes the filter through which everything else is interpreted. The day China learned the world would never be fair was about the collapse of meaning, about discovering that everything you believed was dangerously wrong, about learning that power trumps morality, that vulnerability invites predation, that trust is suicide. This knowledge made China realistic, grimly, defensively, ruthlessly realistic. You see this in every aspect of Chinese strategy: the refusal to rely on others, the obsession with self-sufficiency, the absolute prioritization of sovereignty, the unwillingness to trust international institutions, the determination to become so powerful that 1842 becomes impossible. This isn't the behavior of a confident superpower. This is the behavior of a previously traumatized victim determined to never be a victim again, who's willing to do whatever it takes to ensure safety, who interprets every action through the lens of potential threat, who sees the world as fundamentally hostile because the world was fundamentally hostile. China isn't trying to conquer the world. China is trying to make sure the world can never conquer China again. And if that makes China seem aggressive, defensive, paranoid, that's acceptable. Because being liked was never the lesson of 1842. Being powerful enough to never be vulnerable again was the lesson. Now you understand, and understanding changes how you see everything that follows. The world did this to China. Now China is building a world where it can't be done to them again. That's not revisionism, that's just what trauma looks like at the scale of civilizations.